In 1348, across every major economy in Europe, wages began to rise. Not slowly, sharply, labor became expensive, suddenly scarce. Workers who had never held leverage in their lives were negotiating terms. This should have been chaos. Instead, for a brief period, it looked like prosperity. Markets adjusted, land values shifted. Credit arrangements rewrote themselves. The entire monetary architecture of feudalism began to bend, and the people in power, those who controlled the land, the grain reserves, the taxation systems, did what powerful people always do when the ground shifts beneath them. They tried to freeze the system in place. What happened next wasn't a collapse. It was a transformation so complete that the world that existed before 1347 would never return. But here's what most people miss. The danger wasn't in the death toll. It was in what survived, and who controlled it afterward. And the real shift wasn't visible in prices. It was underneath them. If this walk through financial history sharpened how you understand risk, take a moment to like the video. It quietly tells the system this work has value. Because what happened in the century after the Black Death reveals something critical about how economic power actually transfers. Picture England in 1340. A village of 200 souls. 80% work the land. They don't own it. They owe labor, days per week, to the lord who does. In exchange, they farm small plots for subsistence. Barely. This isn't slavery, it's a binding economic contract enforced by law, tradition, and the fact that there is nowhere else to go. The entire system runs on surplus extraction. The lord takes grain. The grain feeds armies, funds churches, flows into trade networks that connect London to Flanders to Venice. It's stable, it's centuries old, and it delivers predictable returns to those positioned at the top. At the time, this looked unshakable. What no one questioned was the structure holding it up. Feudalism didn't emerge from cruelty, it emerged from collapse. When Rome fell, so did its monetary system, its roads, its legal enforcement, its trade routes. What replaced it wasn't barbarism, it was localism. Communities reorganized around the only durable asset left, land, and land required labor to produce anything, so a deal formed. Protection in exchange for work, stability in exchange for obligation. The lord provided defense, dispute resolution, and access to milling and baking infrastructure. The serf provided labor. For 3 centuries, this worked. Population grew, agricultural output expanded, towns formed, trade resumed. By 1300, Europe's population had nearly tripled since the year 1000, but the system had one unspoken assumption baked into its foundation. Labor had to remain abundant. Because if it did not, if the supply of workers ever fell sharply, the entire bargaining structure inverted. And in 1347, something arrived that no economic model had priced in. Yersinia pestis, the plague. It worked, but only under conditions that would not last. Between 1347 and 1353, the Black Death killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population, 30 million people. Gone. The immediate effect was catastrophe. Villages emptied, markets stopped, entire regions fell silent. But within a decade, something unexpected began to happen. Survivors inherited wealth, land per capita increased. There were fewer mouths to feed from the same amount of arable soil. And most importantly, labor became scarce. For the first time in living memory, workers had options. A peasant could leave, walk to the next manor, offer his labor to the highest bidder. Landowners, desperate to plant crops before the season ended, began competing. Wages doubled. In some regions, tripled. This was real purchasing power, verified in manor court records, tax rolls, and wage ordinances across England, France, and Italy. Workers began eating meat, wearing better wool, purchasing goods that had previously been luxuries. Consumption increased. Demand for manufactured goods rose. Urban wages followed rural ones upward. On the surface, this looked like broadly distributed prosperity, but every economic gain created a corresponding pressure. Landowners saw their margins compress. Fixed rents, collected in currency that was now worth less relative to wages, stopped covering costs. Labor obligations that serfs had traditionally owed became unenforceable when the serf could simply leave. The financial plumbing of feudalism began to strain, not collapse, strain, because the people who held power understood exactly what was happening, and they were not going to let the system rebalance on its own. In 1349, England passed the Ordinance of Labourers. In 1351, it became the Statute of Labourers. France followed with similar edicts, so did Italian city-states. The language was clear. Wages were capped at pre-plague levels. Workers were forbidden from leaving their manors. Employers who paid above the maximum faced fines. Workers who demanded more faced imprisonment. This wasn't tyranny for its own sake. It was an attempt to preserve the economic structure that had governed Europe for 300 years. And at first, it seemed enforceable. Courts prosecuted violators, landowners coordinated, the legal system aligned with landed interests, because the legal system was landed interests, but enforcement required universal compliance. And the economics were working against them. A landowner who followed the law couldn't harvest his fields. His neighbor, who quietly paid above the cap, could. The defector gained an immediate competitive advantage, so violations spread, not as rebellion, as rational economic behavior. By 1370, wage caps were widely ignored. By 1380, they were unenforceable. Manor courts still recorded violations, but stopped punishing them. The system didn't collapse in a single dramatic moment. It eroded. Gradually, quietly, nothing collapsed. And that was the problem. Pay attention to this part, because what happened next wasn't driven by the plague itself. It was driven by the response to rising wages, and who absorbed the cost. By 1380, England's fiscal position was deteriorating. The 100 Years' War with France was expensive. The crown needed revenue. But the traditional sources, rents, feudal obligations, agricultural tithes, were no longer reliable. Wages had risen, rents had not. The landed nobility was squeezed, so the crown turned to a different mechanism, taxation. In 1377, Parliament imposed a poll tax, a flat levy on every person over the age of 14. It was regressive by design, meant to recapture lost revenue from workers who were now earning more. It was tolerable, barely. In 1379, they tripled it. In 1381, they tripled it again. This was not economic mismanagement. It was an intentional attempt to reassert fiscal control over a population that had, for 30 years, been gaining economic independence. And in June 1381, it triggered the Peasants Revolt. 60,000 workers marched on London. They executed tax collectors, burned manor records, demanded the abolition of serfdom. The rebellion was suppressed within weeks. Its leaders were hanged. But the economic reality didn't change. Labor was still scarce. Wages were still high. Enforcement was still impossible. From this point on, the outcome was no longer optional. Over the next century, feudalism dissolved. Not everywhere, not evenly, but irreversibly. Serfdom declined across Western Europe. By 1500, it was nearly extinct in England and France. Labor became a market transaction. Wages were negotiated. Workers moved freely. Land ownership shifted. Smallholders consolidated plots. A yeoman class emerged. Farmers who owned their land outright and hired labor when needed. Urbanization accelerated. Workers migrated to towns where wage labor was the norm. Craft guilds grew. Manufacturing expanded. And the people who had held power before, they adapted. The landed nobility stopped relying on feudal obligations and began enclosing common lands, converting them to sheep pastures for the wool trade. Others moved into commerce, banking, and royal administration. Political power shifted towards centralized monarchies. Kings who could tax commerce and wage earners became more powerful than lords who relied on peasant labor. Wealth redistributed, but not downward for long. The workers who gained wages in the aftermath of the plague did not build dynastic fortunes. They consumed. Their children faced a different world, where capital and land ownership, not labor scarcity, determined leverage. The bourgeoisie rose. The merchant class expanded. And over the following 2 centuries, they would build the financial instruments, trade networks, and colonial systems that concentrated wealth far more efficiently than feudalism ever had. If you care about smart financial insights, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss out. Here's what matters now. The Black Death didn't destroy an economic system because of the deaths. It destroyed it because the survivors had leverage, and the people in power tried to suppress that leverage through law. When the economics and the enforcement diverged, enforcement lost. Not immediately, not visibly, but inevitably. This is the pattern that repeats. Prices are the headline. Plumbing is the story. In 1348, the headline was Wages Rising. The story was a labor market that had inverted the power structure of feudalism, and a legal system that couldn't reimpose the old terms. History doesn't repeat events. It repeats incentives. We live in a different world, different assets, different mechanisms. But the underlying logic hasn't changed. When a system depends on a specific condition remaining stable, abundant labor, cheap energy, low interest rates, cooperative trade partners, and that condition shifts, the system doesn't collapse right away. It strains. People with power try to freeze the structure in place. They use policy tools. They adjust rules. They reassure markets that the old framework still holds. And for a while it does. Until enforcement costs exceed the value of what's being enforced, the question isn't whether the economy is strong. The question is, strong under what conditions? And what happens when those conditions change? Because late cycle markets don't announce themselves with crashes. They announce themselves with rigidity, with systems that stop adapting, with prices that look stable, while the plumbing underneath tightens. The Black Death didn't create a crisis because it killed people. It created a crisis because it revealed which parts of the system were flexible and which were not. And the parts that couldn't bend broke, not all at once, but completely. Two things stay true across every economic transition. First, systems that look strongest often are, but only within the conditions they were built for. When those conditions shift, strength becomes fragility. The harder a system resists adapting, the more violent the adjustment when it finally comes. Second, power doesn't disappear, it transfers. The workers who gained leverage after the Black Death didn't keep it permanently. They spent it. The people who controlled capital, land, and trade routes reorganized and reasserted control through different mechanisms. The lesson isn't that catastrophes redistribute wealth. It's that they expose who holds real optionality and who is depending on the system staying frozen. We're not living through a plague, but we are living through a period where assumptions that held for decades are being tested, where labor markets are tight, where monetary policy is shifting, where geopolitical stability is no longer guaranteed. And the question worth asking isn't what happens next. It's whether you're positioned for flexibility or depending on the old structure holding. Because history suggests that when the plumbing changes, the price eventually follows, and by the time it's obvious, repositioning is no longer quiet. If this helped you see the system more clearly, consider liking the video and subscribing. Not for predictions, but for perspective. Because understanding how power shifts is more valuable than guessing when.